Great Britain. It is one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. Its reputation as a geographically wealthy empire was legendary, and it was an entity so powerful it steered the course of history for hundreds of years. How could such a country recede to the lonely island it is today? And how is it that even though it is small, it still takes a major role within world politics today? How did Great Britain come from such a historic empire and make the transition into a globalized country? During the time of Rome, the island of England was one of its territories. But during its fall, the Romans were driven out due to increasing conflicts with the Vikings and Saxons. Eventually, the Normans conquered the disarrayed island. With all of England now ruled by a cruel king, William the Conqueror, he immediately began building huge structures to fortify the area, using architecture the local population had never seen before. With people working on structures like the original Tower of London, it gave the small country the economic boost needed for the future ahead. Then King Henry VIII came around. He was not a Norman king, but of English blood. As king, he heavily industrialized the British Navy and cut all ties with Rome, kickstarting what he envisioned to be a new empire. He also initiated the invention of the cast iron cannon, replacing the heavy and more expensive bronze cannons. He was also the first to place heavy artillery on wooden ships, giving them the new name, the warship. With these new technologies, he had the means of making his dream of a power-hungry empire, the likes of which the early world had never seen before. During the times of war that followed, Britain had encountered many adversaries, most famous of that being Spain and France, whose conflict with Britain will continue with ferocity for the following century. But in those times of war, much in the way of military and naval resources were needed, and iron cannons and big fleets are cool and all, but they are also expensive. Britain, just as itself, simply did not have the kind of resources available to sustain such an imperial hunger. So it expanded further, taking territories as it pleased, accumulating more and more resources to power its engines of war. That is what people would like to think. But even then, Britain was not known as an empire. It did fight many battles and struggle for power, but it was only until the European Industrial Revolution in 1760 that Britain began to see the potential profit in owning overseas colonies, thanks to the new technology that allowed world trade to happen efficiently. So they began to kick off their first empire by building plantations on the Caribbean islands and Northern America. They had also colonized many parts of Asia, including the more famous East Indies. East India was made famous because it was managed by the English-chartered East India Trading Company. Many companies like this were very powerful in their time and had an influence in world politics. With these companies, Britain would let the plantations trade resources from places like India for resources from those colonies. All the while, due to trading laws set in place, Britain would profit from both the trading company and the colony. So Britain's colonialism was not entirely driven by conquest, but trade. In fact, Britain was known for that. But eventually, the 13 American colonies revolted, and the humiliating loss of America marked the end of the First Empire in the early 1800s. The Second Empire started right where the first left off. Once recovering from the humiliating loss of America, the British continued onward to Australia, New Zealand, and various others. Their accumulation of colonies also increased after both victories of the Napoleonic Wars. This was also a time of new regulations. The British had previously instituted that colonies were bound to the crown in terms of export, but in the new era, free trade was permitted, and slavery was also abolished in order to improve relations with native peoples. Unfortunately, many colonies began to grow more independent of the British Empire as generations grew up outside of the home island. These colonies began to fight for their independence, with inspiration coming from the United States. In response, on 1867, Britain began to recede its powers of control from many countries, including Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. Unfortunately, this did not extend to India, as the East India Company was still very important to Britain. In 1945, when the Second World War began to come to an end, the four founding members of the UN, the US, the UK, Russia, and China, formed together to discuss an idea. They discussed the idea of clearing the previous League of Nations and beginning a new organization called the United Nations. They did this because those war-battered countries experienced firsthand just how ineffective the previous League of Nations was at keeping the peace. So they began with the even more powerful UN in hopes of creating a more peaceful world. In doing so, they wrote a new vision for the UN, stating that its main purpose was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. The UN did have an international army, but it did not have the power to conduct attacks. It was only allowed to commence combat when fired upon. But on the political side of things, a general meeting of the representatives of each member of the UN would join 3 months out of the year. Once together, they would then discuss general matters and problems going on within the world. From there, they would evolve into presenting recommendations and discussions on what should be done next. But each of the 5 permanent members of the UN also had the power to veto. This allowed countries with such power to stop an action presented by any country dead in its tracks, solely based on their own judgment. It is uncertain when the British Empire actually ended, but most historians agree that it is in fact over, and it ended somewhere around the 20th century. After the Second World War ended, the empire gradually faded away as their colonies began to declare independence from the crown. In the place of an empire was now a strong, independent English island that is no longer imperialistic or involved in colonialism. It is now involved in bigger things as it continues onward. It is globalizing through world politics and international trade throughout its own means. So in conclusion, sole participation in the UN did not globalize Britain. Globalization is merely expanding one's peoples to interact or affect others internationally. But through imperialism and colonization, Britain set itself up to be globalized, and in turn globalized other countries by expanding relations and trade throughout the world.